Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Very excited about today's guest. He's a fan favorite. He is, I'm going to stand by it, even though he chastised me before for saying this, one of the greatest writers around today, one of the clearest thinkers. Not since Yuval Levin dined alone has there been a more lucid writer and thinker. I'm speaking, of course, of Jonathan Rauch of The Atlantic. Jonathan, welcome back to the Remnant.
I'm happy to be here and honored to be compared with Yuval, even though I should be your favorite, not one of your favorites.
Fair. We had to, for listeners, we had to re-record the opening where he chastised me for saying it.
I was offended.
He was merely one of my favorite writers. All right, so I originally reached out to you, but you were on vacation or on a reporting assignment or on a 3-state killing spree or something, and couldn't come on because you and I are part of this very a select group of people who don't think smoke-filled room is a bad word, right? Or that we're not unduly triggered by the concept of parties in a democracy behaving undemocratically. And you wrote this great piece for The Atlantic. The party is not over. Nominations belong to parties, not to candidates. And you were, of course, responding to the maneuvering of Joe Biden off of the ticket and leading to the nomination of Kamala Harris. So why don't you just sort of, I mean, this is somewhat familiar territory for my listeners because I rant about this quite a bit, but why don't you sort of walk us through the piece, the history, your take on just this point, and then we can broaden it out to other and various sundry things.
Well, possibly the biggest and most consequential change in politics in my lifetime has been stripping the parties of their historical prerogative to choose their nominees. And that is, by parties, I mean the party organizations, the professionals, the caucuses, the legislatures, the party chairs, state and local chairs, all those people who make up the professional party, stripping them of the power to choose their nominees, giving that to primary voters, and then simply rubber stamping the primary voters' decision at a convention. So in 1968, there's a disaster at the Democratic Convention. The Democrats decide to go to direct primaries. This results in an immediate catastrophe. George McGovern loses 49 states, the selection of the people. What then happens is that both parties go to a mixed system, a hybrid system, which combines primaries with some elements of the smoke-filled rooms. Donors have a lot of say over who gets money, and party officials' endorsements become very important, and you want to trot those people out. And then the media looks to the party organizations for signals. So you get what's called the invisible primary, which is right alongside the formal primaries. You have the contention for the party's kind of nod of approval. And this turns out to be a very good system because year after year, you get well-qualified, formidable nominees, and you get people like saying, well, I'll be darned, these are good choices. If Bob Dole had won instead of Bill Clinton in 1996, we'd have a perfectly fine president. That stops being true in 2016, and that's the year two candidates, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, realize they can bypass the invisible primary. They can go straight to social media. They can go straight to small donors for money. They can just skip a lot of the endorsements and, in fact, campaign against the endorsements. And the result of that is that both parties, but especially the Republicans, lose control of who their nominee is, or actually the Democrats don't. They rally. They put Biden on the ticket. They beat Trump. But the Republican Party loses the ability to control its nominations. That process, that power now belongs primarily to Donald Trump and his MAGA movement. What we just saw was a landmark because we saw the reassertion in a spectacular fashion by the Democratic Party structure the professionals and the donors and the advisors, no, we're taking back the nomination. It does not belong to Joe Biden. We don't think he can win. We also don't think he can serve. We want someone else. And they were able to do that. And not only could they do it, they did it remarkably seamlessly and apparently effectively. And that's reestablishing a principle which people like me thought was basically lost, which is that nominations don't belong to individual candidates. They belong to parties. And that's a good principle.
So obviously I agree with you. I have quibbles about all of it. You know, when I want to go into pundit mode, I can point out that, for instance, they didn't talk very much about how he couldn't govern for 4 more years. They just basically talked about how he couldn't win. At least that's the way the press framed the whole thing. And it seems to me not being able to be president is a more important thing than not being able to be a winning candidate in some sort of high-minded way. But be that as it may, I agree. It was more seamless than I thought it would be. I was very much in favor of it for all sorts of reasons. But what do you say to people I have the hardest time explaining to people that institutions in a democratic society, that democratic institutions in a democratic society do not need to be internally democratic. And it is very difficult, I have found, for people to hold on to that idea for very long. You can get them to nod when you say, well, do you think the Marines should be democratic? You know, let the platoon vote on what hill to take, and they all go, no, that would be stupid. Do you think your business should be democratic, where the janitors and the cashiers get to vote on, new business lines? No, that would be ridiculous. And you can go down this line. You think the Catholic Church should be democratic, and that everyone gets a vote on the Pope? No, that would be ridiculous. But then you say, so do you think the political parties should be democratic? Well, of course they have to be democratic. We live in a democracy. And it's very hard to get them to bite onto and digest this idea. And basically, just before we expand this a little bit, I'm sure you've run into some version of this. What is your preferred way of explaining to people that it does not need to be thus?
Well, it's hard because no one younger than I am, I'm 64, even remembers political parties that actually convened at conventions where the outcome was not predetermined and gathered together as a party to decide who to go forward with. That's simply not something Americans understand. They think parties are brands or vehicles, and candidates just kind of assume them. So we have a big job to do in the United States to try to restore some understanding of what parties do. In the short term, the way I've had a little bit of success explaining it is that the founders designed our system to be a hybrid, a partnership between the people and professionals. They could have gone with direct democracy where everyone votes on everything all the time. Instead, they went with a partnership where you're going to have professional politicians and you're also going to have the electorate, and they're going to guide and correct each other, but you need both. And parties, really the nominating process operates best on the same principle, which is you want a partnership between the party professionals who really understand the candidates and the issues and what's involved in governing and how to put together a coalition and all of those tricky issues. You want them in partnership with the broader public. So of course you want input from the electorate. You just don't want it to be the only thing that matters. And it turns out when you poll people on this, as the political scientist Ray LaRaja did a couple of years ago, and as a more recent poll confirms, it turns out that the public is completely fine with the idea of a partnership between professionals and voters. They like that system. Guess who doesn't like it? The so-called political reform community and activists and interest groups, because they're the ones that are really prospering under the primary only system, because they're good at manipulating the voters and running attack ads and raising money and channeling it to preferred candidates and recruiting candidates who will do their bidding in office. But the obstacle here is not fundamentally the electorate.
Yeah, so it's funny. Every few years I used to write this column because, Republicans are always accused of, voter suppression and all these kinds of things. We can debate where on the spectrum the accuracy of some of those charges are. And I would always point out, but, in big cities, the worst, peddlers of voter suppression tactics are teachers unions and government sector unions who very much like low turnout primaries in places like New York, because if they can get all of their members to vote in a very low turnout election, then they are the majority makers. And you see this time and again where there's this massive incumbency protection racket in big cities, and government sector, public sector unions in particular, game the system so that, like primaries are in the middle of August in New York, like weird times where no one's going, and the teachers unions show up in huge numbers and they're decisive. And the one group that you left out, though, which I think you'll agree with me, is basically the professional, the base representing media, which dominates particularly on cable news, but also talk radio and podcasts and those guys. It is amazing how, just picking a fight with people on the right on this, every 5 minutes somebody says to me, "We're not a democracy, we're a republic." And they say this like I'm a moron, right? And that they have the secret sauce. They know how the force works, and they know the history and all. Mike Lee does it every 5 minutes, and Mike Lee's smart. At least he's been red pilled, but they say it with this knowing way of like how brave they are being, and that is precisely the crowd that says small donors are awesome, primaries are awesome, primary election voters should determine everything. And the last place they want to actually introduce, by their own definition of what republicanism is into the party system. And, that crowd, that sort of monetizing, anger, mobilizing small donors crowd is deeply, deeply invested in the current primary model.
Yes, and on both sides, and well, of course, yes, you're right. I agree with what you just said, and then you can add to it if you want to put in one additional element to make the system even more rickety, unrepresentative, and toxic. It would be a first past the post partisan primary, where if you got 4 or 5 candidates, the person who gets the nomination may walk out of there with only 30% of the vote.
Right.
And that means not only are you having, 8 to 10% of the electorate, a non-representative group, choose the candidate, often at the behest of special interests, you don't even have a majority of that.
Right.
So a lot of focus recently, for years, everyone in the so-called reform community, I say so-called because I don't always agree with their ideas for reform, but people in the reform community were hammering money. Money in politics was the big problem. There's been a shift over the past 5 or 6 years entirely for the better, where reformers and activists and political scientists and politicians have increasingly realized that if you have to fix one thing in American politics, it's got to be the nomination system. That's the most broken thing, and that you cannot have moderate voters if there are no moderate candidates, and there will be no moderate candidates if most members of Congress are coming out of safe seats where they're effectively being chosen by the most extreme and small numbers of people. There's a quote. Unfortunately, I have never confirmed this quote, so it may not be accurate, but I think the spirit is accurate. It's attributed to Tom Massey. Is that his first name, Tom? Member of Congress?
I think so, yeah. Thomas.
Very conservative, yeah.
Yeah.
And what I was told he said, I used to think that I won my primaries because I was a tough Tea Party conservative. Then I realized I'm winning my primaries because I'm the craziest motherfucker in the room. Now, I hope he said that.
He did say it. Yeah. I mean, it's not verbatim, but that's the gist of it. Yeah.
Yeah. This is a problem in a democracy because you don't want to be turning over your government to the craziest motherfucker in the room.
Yeah. So question about the Democratic Party. That is, I have a theory about why the Democratic Party has a better record right now on thwarting populist takeovers. Right? I mean, Hillary Clinton survived and became the nominee in 2016 with the Bernie Sanders assault. In 2020, Bernie Sanders and other Bernie Sanders imitators, which I still to this day do not understand why, basically, with the exception of one or two very minor candidates, the Democratic field all thought they had to compete for the Bernie Sanders lane rather than like the Clinton lane. But regardless, they beat off the populist, hordes again and maneuvered Biden into that position. And I have a theory about this, which is that the Democratic Party historically is the party of populism. And going back to William Jennings Bryan and Huey Long, right? And even FDR, who managed populism while at the same time exploiting it in certain ways. And, lasted through the George Wallace, experiment and all that. And so it had muscle memory, right? That's where the superdelegates stuff came from, was this way to say, hey, look, if we let the torch carrying guys go too far with this, it'll screw us. So we need some countervailing mechanism. And so there was still an institutional memory about the party mattering in a way. Also, being the party of government gives you a more mature understanding of the role of institutions and how to use institutions. And meanwhile, the Republican Party had very little experience dealing with populist insurgencies in this way. I mean, yeah, like Reagan benefited from the tax revolts and that kind of stuff, but really they like to play footsie with cultural populism and all that kind of stuff, but they were unprepared for the creature they had created with the combination of Fox News, so that when actually the populist hordes surged in, they had dedicated 20 years of rhetoric to saying this is all good and we have to, and there's no problem with this. And it's never backfired on us before, because George W. Bush, with the gay marriage amendments and various other things and going for the sort of Bubba vote, was able to channel populism towards, success. Even George H.W. Bush with the Pledge of Allegiance stuff, and kept that stuff as a junior partner. But coming with the Tea Parties, and then the Tea Party surge, and then the rise of Trump, which merged sort of blue state bridge and tunnel populism with rural populism, no one had any sort of experience or institutional memory about how to deal with something like this. And so they just handed the keys over to Donald Trump because they didn't know how to argue about it. And it's one of the reasons to kind of hope for the Republican Party to get destroyed in an election, if you think this is a problem, because then it will create from the ashes certain mechanisms like the Democratic Party still informally has. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, it makes eminent sense. It's a superb hypothesis, which I would endorse as a historical factor. There are other factors as well. You can't overstate what the Democrats learned in 1972, when the very first thing that happened when they switched to the primary system was a 49-state defeat.
Yeah.
That's the kind of defeat I hope for the MAGA Republican movement. And what that taught the Democrats is, wait a minute, we need to reassert a bit more control over the process. And they did in 1976. People forget this bit of history. It's super interesting. George Wallace ran for his third presidential run in 1976, and he was leading going into Florida, which is a southern state. And the party realized that if he became the nominee, he would be crushed in 1976 by Gerald Ford because he was just a regional candidate and he was too extreme. So the party went to the candidates, all the candidates in the field, and said, we want everyone except Jimmy Carter to sit out the Florida primary in order to clear the field for Carter to defeat Wallace. And without Florida, Wallace can't win. And by today's standards, amazingly, every candidate except Senator Henry Jackson did that. And this had two results, one foreseen and the other unforeseen. The foreseen result is that Wallace was stopped by the party, and the party won the presidency in 1976. The unforeseen result was that the presidency was won by Jimmy Carter. But what we learned from that is this is the point when the Democrats start saying, okay, let's have a hybrid system. They adopt a super delegate program, which Republicans don't have. And that means there's some delegates at the convention who they don't really have much power, but they're there. These are professional politicians and party chairs and people like that. And then there's one other important factor, hard to overestimate, and that's African American voters. They are still pretty much solidly on the Democratic side, and they tend to vote like old-fashioned party machine voters. It is harder to distract them for whatever reason with bright, shiny objects like culture wars and ideology. They're more interested in what have you done for me lately? Are you really on my side? Are you going to be reliable? They're the people who Representative James Clyburn rallied to Joe Biden in South Carolina in 2020, tipping the nomination for him. They just have not gone over to the kind of hardcore extremist cultural populism. And that's given the Democrats an anchor, one that they might lose, but for the time being, it's still there.
Yeah, so the only thing I'd add to that, and I agree with that, I come from the school of thought that everything is made better by more people subscribing to old-fashioned middle-class values. We can debate what those are, right? And one of the things that gets so overlooked is like when we were growing up, when you talked about the African-American base of the Democratic Party, you were almost speaking synonymously about the left-wing base of the party. It was the Jesse Jackson wing, right? I mean, that's the way people talked about it. That's not the case anymore. The left-wing base of the party is overwhelmingly, in terms of their cultural influence, are basically like Jacobin reading, Bernie bro types, barista socialists with open-toed shoes and closed minds, these kinds of people. People love, the mainstream media narrative about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was that she represented this new wave of young voters of color that was, the future and all that kind of stuff. But if you actually looked at the way she beat, what was his name, Crowley in the primary, Crowley did fine with African-American voters and Hispanic voters. Where he got killed in a low turnout primary was with sort of white hipster left-wing voters. And those are the people who populate, to a certain extent, MSNBC green rooms and define a lot of very online Twitter stuff. And the median black voter, especially this black female voter in her mid-50s or whatever, they're to the right of the sort of representative Democrat these days. And they were like, no, we're not going to vote for, what's his face? Well, first of all, Kamala Harris or Cory Booker. We're going to vote for the old white guy who's like this boring, normal Democrat who Jim Clyburn says we can work with. And that pulled the Democratic Party rightward in a way that if you had said 30 years ago, what's going to pull the Democratic Party rightward and get people like Joe Biden elected are black South Carolina voters who think that the party is too left-wing. But that's sort of what happened.
I guess the only thing I disagree with there is that anyone should be surprised by it, because African-American voters have always been, rank and file, that is, more socially conservative than white college-educated elites. And that's become a bit more evident as white college-educated elites drift further and further to the left. But so far,
they didn't vote that way, right? I mean, that's the switch, right? It used to be the Bernie Sanders version of the universe is everybody votes on their economic interests, and then you get this switch to the sort of the intersectionality nonsense and that kind of stuff. And
yeah, that's right. That's right. And the switch
that makes them more right wing ish than they would be when everything was about.
As the political terrain shifts to the culture wars and away from economics, a trend that I don't understand, but it's obviously happened, then the particular mix of African American voters who tend to be more culturally conservative and economically progressive becomes more salient. And that's what we're seeing. But I think it's been fortunate for the Democratic Party, but I don't know that it'll last. We're seeing working class Black and Hispanic voters beginning to drift over to the Republican side. And that's, I think, in the long term, good for the Republicans. But to the extent that it erodes the anchor in the one sane party that we have in the short term, I'm not sure.
Yeah. So let me ask you about that. All right. So let's just take, I know this is a big if, right? But let's just take Trump out of the equation and assume it was a fairly normie, it was Ron DeSantis or Nikki Haley running or something like that. Don't you think it would be better for the country if one's racial identity was not particularly predictive of whether you were a Republican or a Democrat? I mean, wouldn't that be a source of great progress?
Is that a trick question? Because the answer is yes. It would be. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I mean,
we in gay world, we used to complain in the 90s that because we were so partisan for Democrats, they took us for granted. They didn't do anything for us, and we wanted to live in a world where, as happened in 2000, 25% of self-identified homosexual voters voted Republican. And sure, that was a healthy thing. The only aspect of it that's not healthy, this is nothing new, it goes back 50 years, but the sorting of the electorate into a party of the college educated and a party of the non-college educated. The racial intermixing is on balance, other things equal a good thing, but the educational segregation is a bad thing. And those are happening at the same time for the same reason.
No, I think I agree with that. I mean, the only reason I bring this up is I struggle with this insofar as I think it is a long-term good thing for the country that race is becoming less salient as a predictor of political attitudes. At the same time, it is very depressing that this phenomenon is being accelerated by what Donald Trump is doing to the Republican Party. And keeping these two things simultaneously in mind is difficult for me, because I do think, and I do wish progressives and Democrats struggled with this more. There's some really interesting research on this. Jonathan Haidt, Sherry Berman, some other people have written about this, where the more you call people racist, the more likely it is to make them racist. And to say that the only explanation for criticizing Kamala Harris or Barack Obama or opposing this policy or that policy is because of racism, doesn't help it doesn't help opposition to racism, that cause. I can't say anti-racism because that's a complicated term these days. And actually, I think it repels more voters than it attracts over the long term.
Well, I think what we got to hope for here, the Republican Party at the moment is a dumpster fire. I know that sounds like a partisan comment. I'm an independent, but I'm center-right. I have admired and voted for many Republican candidates over the years. But what the MAGA movement has done to the Republican Party is change it from a traditional coalitional party to something more like what's been called a cult of personality. It's a political machine organized around the interests of a single person. And I don't see that salvageable except by losing some elections, preferably by big numbers, which unfortunately is not going to happen in 2024. So over to the Democrats, where you still do see there a pretty traditional coalitional style party. And what I think we need to hope for there to prevent the kind of scenario you're talking about is for Democrats to figure out how to talk to working class voters in a non-alienating, non-supercilious, and non-name-calling way. And they've got the DNA for that, right? I mean, George Wallace, of course, ran as a Democrat. They were traditionally the party of the working man. They've lost that, and that's become a crisis ultimately for both parties.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think if they could just listen to Roy Teixeira about most of these things, they'd be in fine shape.
And not listen to Twitter.
Yeah, for sure. This is a little off subject, but I'm just kind of curious what you think. All right, so the theory I had about how the Democratic Party has muscle memory to deal with populism in a way the Republican Party doesn't. I think you can make a flipped case that the left has no muscle memory about how to deal with anti-Semitism, and the Republican Party does, right? Because the Republican Party has had more trouble with it in the last, I don't know, since the Gentleman's Agreement or whatever. And it is, and the press is constantly looking for evidence that Republicans are bigots and racists, and constantly pointing to it when they find it, and sometimes exaggerating it when they don't find it, or making it up or whatever. But like, there is a kind of a scalded dog, reflex thing on the right. National Review, every now and then you get, people come in who have Jew issues or racial issues, and we would have to sort of say, hey, that's not what we do here, and show them the door, and dealing with the Birchers. And anyway, there's this history of it that people understand on the right, these arguments about how this association undermines the larger project. I think if you look at the way a lot of the mainstream media and a lot of the Democratic Party deals, we were talking this the morning that they announced that Josh Shapiro is not going to be the VP pick. It's going to be Tim Walz from Minnesota. And we can talk about that in a second. But the Democratic Party, and I think the mainstream media generally, in part because of their investment in the Islamophobia arguments from the War on Terror and all these other things, really does not have the suppleness and the experience of figuring out how to sort of call out that kind of bigotry problem on its own side. It's not the same bigotry problem as the right had. It's like, Arab or is Muslim anti-Semitism, which drives a lot of this, is not the same thing as Joe Sobram's anti-Semitism or that kind of thing. But it's a real phenomenon, and it feels to me like even the New York Times does not know how to write about it, does not know how to talk about it. You have to include Islamophobia in every single condemnation about anti-Semitism because of this sort of, coalition of the oppressed kind of logic. And I'm just kind of curious, what do you think about that?
Probably something to it. It's not an area that I've given as much thought to.
Yeah.
It seems right. I think where I would go first to understand the developments of the past year or so is, now you tell me if this is right. I'm okay. Way out on thin ice here. But until October 7th, I think it was pretty easy for progressives to say and believe that they were drawing a sharp line between anti-Semitism and something like anti-Zionism. Mm-hmm. You could be against the policies of the Israeli government and not be anti-Semitic. And I think most of us agreed that that was true in principle, and that that's what a lot of progressive Democrats thought that they were all about. And then along comes October 7th and the immediate reaction at Harvard, where within a matter of, is it days or hours, you have 30 student groups essentially denying Israel's right to exist. And then it quickly becomes clear that what we thought was a bright line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is not a line at all. That individuals and groups are filtering back and forth between this line on a routine and common basis. And it also becomes clearer that if you believe that the state of Israel does not have a right to exist, but that pretty much all other indigenous people in the world do have a right to a state, not to exist, but to a state, I should have said, that you're singling out Jews, and you begin to realize that even in principle, anti-Zionism can be and often is a form of anti-Semitism. And this, I think, kind of throws the cards up in the air. Because suddenly the distinction that the left, the center left, and the far left had agreed upon is no more. And so now what's the distinction? What are we talking about? Who's anti-Semitic? How do we even conceptualize this? I don't know that we really know this anymore. And I don't know that I know it anymore. Okay, so what do you think of that hypothesis?
Oh, I think it's very related to what I'm saying. I just stated mine poorly, and you stated yours well. Insofar as the institutions that we're talking about in like higher education, they don't know how to talk about this stuff either. I mean, there is this this sort of glib notion that says all form, it's like the left has long thought it has a monopoly on political virtue. And so the further you move to the right, the more bad you get, closer to bad things. And the further you go to the left, the closer you get to all good things. And we just saw that. I just saw the other day, Jamie Raskin, the congressman, put out this tweet condemning the Maduro government in Venezuela because we cannot countenance right-wing authoritarianism. And it's like, come on, dude. Like, you can have left-wing authoritarians too. It doesn't have to always be when you're an enemy of democracy that you're a right-winger, right? That's not definitional to right-wing. And so I think that the settler colonial stuff, all that Foucault stuff, all of those sorts of things, the logic of all of that means that you're going to be anti-Israel to one extent or another. And you combine the trolling culture that we now live in, right? And you combine this sort of notion that it's more important to express feelings than to present arguments. That if you feel like Zionists or Nazis and you think you have every right to sort of say gas the Jews or whatever, the response from the administration is, we don't know how to deal with this, right? We've never had left on left friction like this. We don't have the vocabulary for it. And so whereas 5 minutes ago, if you said something that made, a trans kid feel unsafe, they knew exactly how to flood the zone in response and condemn it fairly. I'm not trying to say you should make trans kids feel unsafe, but to make Jewish kids feel unsafe, you have this intersectionality crisis, right? Because the software, they just don't have any subroutines to deal with these things. And the right does. And we have access to a different moral vocabulary for a lot of these things. That's what got Claudine Gay in so much trouble. She just did not have access to the language to give her a very easy answer, right? I mean, it's just a common sense answer about how to deal with like people, threatening violence or shouting anti-Semitic slogans. But they don't have any of that on the shelf to just sort of pull down, and they're learning it on the fly very quickly now. But on the broader point, I agree with you. It's like the way you test whether or not someone's standards are in good faith is when they draw exceptions to them. And whether it's the UN or it's these campus things where free speech, where free speech rules are invoked and revoked selectively based upon who the target is, it tells you something about which targets they think are legitimate and which they aren't. Anyway, it's a rabbit hole. I'll give you the last word if you want to go more on it. It popped into my head, and I do want to get back to some of the party stuff.
Well, it's a rabbit hole, but one easy way to think about it is as a wedge issue. Israel and anti-Semitism and all of those issues have become issues that divide the left and divide the
Right.
Democratic Party in a way that, for the time being, they don't divide the Republican Party. I think they will in the future. I am not convinced that the Republican Party, the MAGA movement, with its deep roots in Christian nationalism, is a safe home for the Jews. But for the time being, the Republican Party is not divided by this issue. I think President Biden actually came from a healthy place on this issue. You know, he went to Israel during wartime to show solidarity. He understands, I think, in a gut level, the moral difference between Israel and Hamas, even recognizing that some terrible things have happened on the battlefield. And some of those things are as a result of Israeli decisions. He understands that moral difference. And what we're going to find out is if the Democrats and the left can come to some kind of decent moral understanding of this issue.
Right, so I do want to engage in some just truly heinous rank punditry in a second, but one last thing on the party stuff. I go back and forth about ranked choice voting. I kind of like it for primaries. I want to see more of it, keep kicking the tires kind of thing. But in a weird way, the reason I'm torn about it is, on the one hand, I'm deeply invested in this idea that the parties should not be all that democratic. And on the other hand, ranked choice voting in some ways is a democratic fix to the problem created by the democratizing of the parties, right? And so the question I kind of have is, first of all, where do you come down on it? But second of all, can you have strong parties under a regime of ranked choice voting? Or is it just, does it render parties to be even more of a brand?
Well, we don't, boy, there's a lot there. So on the very last question, I don't think we really know yet how compatible ranked choice voting and its accompanying, the more important part of ranked choice voting. So I guess your listeners know how this works. But basically, you do.
It never hurts to do a quick explainer, sure.
So the notion here, it's not just ranked choice voting. It's a combination of ranked choice voting in a general election plus what's a nonpartisan primary. And it's these two things together is the standard package. And the way this is supposed to work is, instead of each party going to the polls and using first past the post to put one candidate forward in the general election, you'll have one big primary. Everyone throws their hats in. It could be 10 people, 5, it could be 30 people, whatever it is. And then the top 5 or top 4 vote winners, they could all be the same party. They could all be different parties. They could be from 2 parties. They could be from 5 parties. Doesn't matter. The top 4 or 5 winners of this big nonpartisan primary go on to a general election, which is done by ranked choice voting. And that means people can rate their choices 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And the virtue of that is that you have elimination rounds that are run by a computer. So it's like an instant runoff. So number 4 is eliminated if there are 4 people, and that person's votes are distributed to the next 3. And then number 3 is eliminated, and that their votes are distributed. And the idea here is that you wind up with a winner who is the most acceptable to the most number of people. And it makes it a lot harder for a factional candidate to squeeze through with a plurality, a small plurality. And the notion here is now candidates will have to try to be people's number 2 vote as well as their number 1 vote, which means that they will be less extreme and focused on very narrow extreme agendas. Okay, so that's the idea. So how does it work in practice? It's been tried a few places. I think actually the results are promising. I think because it relies on nonpartisan primaries, it does further weaken the parties organizationally. And I think actually to some extent that's the intention of what people are doing here. So that bothers me. On the other hand, you could argue that party primaries, as they're structured now, are the worst of all worlds, because you're not getting a party decision. The primaries have been hijacked by these small numbers of quite extreme voters who aren't even representative of the party as a whole. Right. And that in that world where that's your alternative, yeah, you're probably better off with a nonpartisan primary in which candidates have to appeal to larger numbers of voters, and the parties become brands. They indicate, well, of these 5 people, this is the one that we think is the best. So I don't think on paper, actually, which of these systems is better. And so where I come down is solidly on the fence, which is try it. In Alaska, the results have been promising. In a couple of other places, they've been promising. I do think ranked choice voting is wildly overhyped. We've seen this before in the 1970s reforms, and then in the McCain-Feingold reforms. It's not going to be transformative. It's going to be on the margins. But, it can help some reasonable people stay in office. The one point you made I'd like to underscore is the place it makes most sense to use ranked choice voting is not in general elections, which is where it's being applied now. It's in the primaries. If you could persuade the parties to go with it, that means instead of having these plurality winners where you've got, 3 moderates splitting their votes so the MAGA extremist slips through with 30%, that wouldn't happen. This would probably tend to bring party primaries more able to coalesce around a mainstream candidate. We don't know that for sure, but I would love to see ranked choice voting in party primaries.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I'm leaning. I mean, I'm with you. Let's kick the tires on it a little bit more, but keep going, right? Keep with the experiments on it. For listeners the easiest way to sort of explain how that worked in Alaska is Sarah Palin is nobody's second choice. Right? I mean, she's a lot of people's first choice, but no one says, "Oh, I'm gonna," I like so and so. He's reasonable and stuff. But if I can't have the reasonable, boring guy, let's go with Sarah Palin, right? So she did fine as a first choice thing, but with that fraction of the party, but with nobody else. And the way I always explain it is, the most popular flavor of ice cream in America is vanilla, even though it is probably very few people's favorite flavor of ice cream. What it is the least objectionable flavor of ice cream to the most people, which is why at weddings and all that kind of stuff, you serve vanilla, because no one gets pissed off getting vanilla, even if their favorite flavor is, mint chocolate chip or something. And we need more vanilla candidates in this country. I mean, I can't believe I'm, the author of Liberal Fascism, talking about how we need to have more vanilla candidates, but we do. And that's sort of the promise.
We need to at least level the playing field. I'm wary of trying to sell a particular reform on the grounds that it'll elect more of type A of candidate and fewer of type B of candidate. And that's not really what I'm out to do. I'm not out to tilt the playing field. The problem is right now the playing field is wildly distorted towards small numbers of non-representative people hijacking what used to be party institutions and turning them into personal brands. And if you want a more representative system that's fair, you're going to have to make some kind of changes. I'd like to see the change be in the direction of what Democrats just did, which is more vetting by party members and officials, professionals, and you can do that. Massachusetts has a system. It's kind of a beauty contest. I don't really understand it, but you kind of have to do well with the party professionals. You have to show your mettle with them. There are all kinds of ways to give party professionals more of a role, not the only role. No one is saying there shouldn't be primaries, but there are all kinds of ways to bring peer review into the process. It's not hard to do.
Yeah. I mean, I'm saying there shouldn't be primaries, but no one's listening to me.
Let's put it this way. There won't be no primaries. So that's the direction I'd like to see going, and more experimentation with. And it turns out the voters are perfectly fine with that. But if we're not going that direction, then I think we have to experiment in the other direction, which is reduce the role of first past the post plurality primaries, because they're just broken. They're just not working.
Yeah. I mean, just to clarify, I take your point about not wanting to rig the system for a certain kind of candidate. My point is that I think we were better off as a country when, in a general election, candidates were aimed at the median voter, right? When we were growing up, you didn't want to get 100% of the primary vote and then stay unchanged in the general. You wanted to get enough of the primary vote that when married to other factions of the party, you won the primary, and then you still had room to tack to the center to win the median voter. And because of all sorts of things, which we didn't talk about, the big sort, that system doesn't work anymore. And so coming up with a system that takes a laser focus on the idea that parties should want to be majority parties, is the way to think about reform. It's like, I want to live in a country where both parties think it's possible to be a 60% majority party. Instead, they both constantly fight to be 50.1% majority parties. And that's why they keep getting thrown out of power. All right. So just.
That's exactly right. I look forward, Jonah. I cannot wait to read your intellectual biography, where you explain how the author of Liberal Fascism comes to where you are today. Yeah, I guess it's the school of hard knocks that we've all been through in the last 10 years.
I would posit that there's more consistency there than my detractors would, but we'll come to that another day. Just very quickly on Tim Walz. By the time people listen to this, they'll already be sick of all the punditry about it. But I feel like it's malpractice not to ask you what you think about Harris picking Walz, and whether you think it's the best pick to actually win.
Can I make you go first?
Sure.
I want you to go first.
Okay, that's fair. That's totally fair. I think it's not the best pick. Full stop. I don't think it's a terrible pick. I have colleagues and friends in our immediate texting, Slacking, Twittering, stuff, of various opinions about this. But I think it proves that that the 2-week run of really a fairly brilliant rollout has come to an end. I think it is very weird to set all these expectations about how it might be Shapiro and hand Republicans this argument that the anti-Semitic fringe of the Democratic Party doesn't want Shapiro. What you'll hear a lot, you sort of flirted with it earlier. People talk about, well, it was his views on Israel that disqualified him. His views on Israel, as far as I know, are indistinguishable from Tim Walz's views and the other shortlisters. The only thing that's different is he's Jewish. And that argument will be made. So if you weren't going to pick Shapiro, letting this conversation go fester as much as it has, I think was not ideal. And doing it in Philly, where you're basically going to humiliate the guy you didn't pick in his backyard by picking the other guy, I think is a weird choice. You could have picked a state like Michigan, where there was no shortlister, that still is valuable. But to get all of Pennsylvania Democratic machine worked up about Shapiro and then not pick him, I think is just a strange tactical move. I don't see what the upside of that is. And lastly, and probably most importantly, I think there are good arguments against Shapiro, and not because he's, of the Hebraic variety, but having two polished former prosecutor lawyer types, overeducated lawyer types on the ticket is a bad signal. And having sort of a former social studies school teacher guy and college and a high school football coach is a better signal. So that's a good argument for Walz. Walz has a good track record of winning in purplish districts and that kind of stuff. That's good for him. But he's also very, very progressive. And the fact that you're getting all this celebration from voters you were going to get anyway, for the most part, and all of this sort of staring at your feet, why didn't they go with Shapiro, from people that you need to be a majority coalition, I think is a sign that this was not perfectly well handled. Now, I've been paying way too much attention to this process. Most people don't. Most people don't give a rat's ass. People keep talking about how Shapiro is much better known. He's still not well known. J.D. Vance wasn't well known, and he had a best-selling book and a movie about him. Tim Walz, a lot of people don't know him. So I'm not sure much of this stuff matters, but as tea leaf reading, I don't think that this was really well handled, and I don't think picking a remarkably progressive guy that puts the BLM riots in Minnesota in play as a talking point and all that kind of stuff is necessarily the best pick. But he's much better than Buttigieg, I'll tell you that.
Well, as usual, you're a better pundit than I am. I will add to what you said, not disagree with it, because it all makes good sense. one thing I'll add is that I'm a bit puzzled, because Tim Walz is from Minnesota, which does not appear to be in play. Mark Kelly of Arizona and Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, those are must-win states for the Democrats. So by not going with one of those two, Vice President Harris has made a strategic decision that she's going to prioritize something other than those key states, which is interesting. It may suggest confidence, or it may suggest that she just thought that Shapiro's Jewishness, along with her own Jewish husband, was too much of a stretch in this year. It may reflect something else altogether, which I think people don't think about enough. At least people who haven't run for president don't think enough about, which is she's going to have to serve with the guy if she wins for 4 years. And we have all seen, going back to Henry Wallace, back in the 1930s, what an albatross a poor choice can be in office and what a strong choice can be in office. And we saw that having a very powerful vice president in the form of Dick Cheney ultimately, I think, caused a lot of harm for George W. Bush. I think he believed that by his second term when he really reined in Cheney. And one of the things that I would guess has happened is that she sat down with these people and talked to them and may have just made a gut decision. This is the guy I like. This is the guy I want at my side through the campaign and then onward. And then I'll point out something else which is kind of interesting to me. You tell me if there's anything to this. If I'm not mistaken, Governor Walz is the author of the weird meme. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So
he started it.
He started this. For years, Democrats' problem with Trump has been that the shriller they talk about him, the more it helps him. Because people think Democrats are being weird and shrill, and they're talking about it's the end of democracy in the last election, and those things haven't happened. And meanwhile, working class wages are up. And along comes a guy who is the very picture of a normal American, the ultimate normie candidate. His politics are kind of left-wing, but in his background, in the way he presents, in his race and gender, all of that stuff, he's way more normal than anyone except, Mark Kelly. And he invents this meme, and by God, the Democrats start getting some traction with this combination of ridicule and pointing out to people just how bizarre Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are. And if I'm Kamala Harris, maybe that gets my attention. And maybe I'm starting to think the way I win this election is wear the normie ticket. We're the people who are not crazy. She has run as far to the center as she can in a short amount of time. And I've been interested to see how quiet the far left has been in billing herself as a tough prosecutor. And this may be another signal. You know what? She gets it. She has got to appeal to middle-class white American men who have just had it with 10 years of weird politics. So is that crazy?
No, I don't think that's crazy. And both analyses can be true, I think, right? I mean, I think that, like, at the end of the day, as I'm sure I've mentioned to you before, the thing that we hate the most on this podcast are monocausal explanations of anything. And so and by all accounts, Kamala Harris is almost, some would say beyond to a fault, overly cautious in her decision-making, and likes to have long debates in front of her on various sides. So she probably had 20 different reasons to do this, right? And what her motivated reasoning was ultimately, there's another factor, I think, that sort of buttresses your point, which is that everyone thinks Josh Shapiro is a future presidential candidate in his own right. Having Josh Shapiro land and day one start thinking about his political future rather than Harris's would be concerning, right? Walz, and even though this is so sad, but Walz is the same age as Kamala Harris. He looks 15 years older. He says it's because not only was he a school principal, but he had to be the supervisor for the school cafeteria, and that ages you, which is a good line, you know.
Good line, yeah.
And the idea that, you know, Walz understands that vice president is as good as it gets is, and so that's he does not have he's not going to be plotting his presidential campaign the moment he gets, you know, into the vice president's residence. That might be a big factor there too. But even if it has nothing to do with the, you know, I hate to put it this way, the Jewish question, right? You know, but even if it has nothing to do with it, we've still gotten to a point where it appears to a lot of people that it has something to do with it, right? There's been this conversation for a very long time. And this sort of gets to my point about the muscle memory problems on the left and right about these various things. If the GOP was having an internal debate about whether it could withstand having a Jewish running mate on the ticket, and people were saying, well, there are a lot of people in the party who just wouldn't like it, the way the national conversation about it would be so different. It would be the long-standing demons going back to, you know, the 1930s in the Republican Party are coming to the fore, and this, you know, the bigotry problem with the GOP. But it's not the way it's necessarily been discussed for Democrats, and that is actually the weird thing about it is it's opened up this line of criticism about this. So, like, even if it's had very little to do with all of that, just the way this is rolled out, I think it let that idea fester, which was not great. But I agree with you entirely. I think it's great that she's flip-flopping on all of this stuff. I think it's very smart. I very much like it when very left-wing candidates move to the center. And I think there are a lot of conservatives who don't really, you know, like, you should celebrate policy changes in your direction, even if you think they're fake, because that helps you guarantee that they will pay a political cost if they go back on them. And this gets at this long-standing thing, which maybe it'll come out of my intellectual biography, which is that I think too many conservatives mistake what is best for the Republican Party with what is best for conservatism, when in fact, Kamala Harris running to the center is pretty good for the goals of conservatism and pretty bad for the Republican Party, because it makes it harder to run against her for the Republicans. But it moves the center of gravity of American politics rightward, which should be the proper goal of a conservative movement.
If there's one thing that I endlessly repeat to my friends who don't like MAGA, don't like Trump for all the usual reasons, but are worried sick about the left wing of the Democratic Party and say things like Joe Biden isn't an extremist, but the people behind him are, and Kamala Harris's administration will be run by the radical woke left and all of that, and therefore they have no choice but to vote for Trump. My refrain is always, look, the way you fight the extreme left is not to vote for the extreme right or support the extreme right. It's to support the center left and the center right. And that's how you defeat them. And to the extent that Kamala Harris's candidacy proves that point, that'll be a good thing.
All right, with that, Jonathan Rauch, you've been generous. We had some technical issues, so we've kept you longer than intended or promised. But it's always great to have you here. Thanks for doing this.
I'd love to come back anytime and eagerly await your intellectual memoir.
All right, two things. One, do not close your browser on pain of death until your audio uploads. And two, you might recall I did this stupid gag at the end where you say, no, you won't, this is a podcast. I can explain it again, but if you could just say, no, you won't, this is a podcast.
No, you won't, this is a podcast.